Ricardo woke up before dawn, the sky still painted with the soft hues of night. The room was dimly lit, and he quietly slipped out of bed to avoid waking Mariana. His heart pounded with a mix of excitement and anxiety as he straightened his tie in front of the mirror. Today was his first day at Mendez and Associates, a law firm renowned not just in Sao Paulo but across Brazil. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, the culmination of years of hard work and ambition. Coming from a modest background, Ricardo had always dreamed of climbing the social ladder through his profession. His parents had worked tirelessly to provide for him, instilling in him the values of hard work and determination. Mariana, his wife, had been his unwavering support through law school and the early, grueling years of his career. They both hoped this new job would finally offer the stability and prosperity they had longed for. The skyscraper that housed Mendez and Associates towered over the bustling streets of downtown Sao Paulo. As Ricardo approached the building, he felt a surge of pride. This was a place of power, where the city's most influential legal minds gathered to shape the future of countless businesses and individuals. The lobby was grand, with marble floors and high ceilings that echoed the whispers of success. He was greeted by a receptionist with a professional smile and directed to the 23rd floor. The elevator ride seemed to stretch on forever as Ricardo's anticipation grew. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, but Ricardo's thoughts were inward, focusing on the challenges and opportunities that awaited him. Stepping out of the elevator, he was immediately met by Jorge, one of the senior partners. Jorge was a tall, imposing figure with sharp eyes and a confident demeanor. His reputation as a brilliant yet ruthless lawyer preceded him. "Welcome to Mendez and Associates, Ricardo," Jorge said, extending a hand. "I've heard good things about you. We're glad to have you on board." "Thank you, Jorge." "I'm excited to be here," Ricardo replied, shaking his hand firmly. Jorge led him on a tour of the office, which was a marvel of modern design. Glass walls, sleek furniture, and contemporary art pieces gave the space an air of sophistication and efficiency. The constant buzz of activity was palpable, with lawyers and assistants moving briskly through the corridors, engaged in intense discussions or focused on their screens. "This will be your office," Jorge said, stopping in front of a spacious room with a large mahogany desk and a view that overlooked the heart of Sao Paulo. "Get settled in. We have high expectations for you." Ricardo thanked him and stepped into his new office. He took a moment to appreciate the space, running his fingers over the smooth surface of the desk. This was it, the opportunity to make a name for himself in the legal world. He arranged his belongings, setting up pictures of Mariana and Lucas, his teenage son, who was the driving force behind his ambitions. His first day was filled with introductions and a whirlwind of information. Ricardo met his new colleagues, a mix of seasoned veterans and ambitious newcomers like himself. The discussions were intense, revolving around high-profile cases and complex legal strategies. Ricardo quickly realized that success here required not just legal acumen but also political savvy and a willingness to play hardball. As the day wore on, Ricardo's confidence grew. He felt he belonged here, among the best and brightest. Yet, there was an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite place. Subtle glances and hushed conversations hinted at deeper, more complex dynamics within the firm. Late in the afternoon, Ricardo was called into a meeting with Jorge and a few other senior partners. They discussed a major case involving a corporate merger worth millions. Ricardo was given a stack of files and instructed to familiarize himself with every detail. "We need someone with your skills on this," Jorge said. "This is a significant client, and we cannot afford any mistakes." Ricardo nodded, eager to prove himself. He spent the next few hours poring over the documents. The case was intricate, with multiple parties and a tangled web of legal issues. As he delved deeper, he noticed inconsistencies and questionable practices. Something felt off, but he pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. By the time he left the office, the sky was dark and the city lights twinkled below. He was exhausted but exhilarated. Ricardo returned home to Mariana and Lucas, sharing the highlights of his day over dinner. Mariana listened with pride, but also with a hint of concern. "It sounds like a great opportunity, Ricardo," she said, "but remember to stay true to yourself. Success isn't worth it if it costs you your integrity." Her words lingered in Ricardo's mind as he lay in bed that night. He knew the world of high-stakes law was ruthless, but he was determined to navigate it without losing his moral compass. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he believed in his ability to rise above them. The next morning, Ricardo arrived early at the office, ready to dive into the new case. He spent hours analyzing the documents, uncovering more anomalies. As the pieces began to fit together, a troubling picture emerged. The firm's client had engaged in dubious practices, and there were signs that some partners at Mendez and Associates were complicit. Ricardo felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was more than just a challenging case, it was a moral quandary. He knew that pursuing this could jeopardize his position and potentially his career. But ignoring it went against everything he believed in. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jorge stepped in, his expression unreadable. "How's it going, Ricardo?" Ricardo hesitated, then decided to be candid. "I've found some troubling information, Jorge. There are irregularities that need to be addressed." Jorge's eyes narrowed slightly, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Just remember, Ricardo, discretion is paramount. Our clients trust us to handle their matters with the utmost confidentiality." Ricardo nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine as Jorge left the room. The lines between right and wrong were becoming increasingly blurred, and Ricardo realized he was now part of a dangerous game. That night, Ricardo shared his concerns with Mariana again. "It's not just a challenging case, Mariana. There are things that don't add up. I'm worried about what I'm getting into," he admitted, his voice heavy with worry. Mariana squeezed his hand, her gaze steady and reassuring. "Follow your instincts, Ricardo. Do what you know is right, even if it's difficult." Her words gave him strength. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he was determined to uphold his integrity. The journey ahead was fraught with peril, but Ricardo was ready to face it head-on. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a path that would test his very core. The following weeks at Mendez and Associates were a blur of activity. Ricardo threw himself into his work, determined to make a mark. The initial excitement of joining such a prestigious firm began to give way to the realization of the immense pressure and expectations placed upon him. He spent long hours in his office, often staying late into the night, reviewing cases and preparing legal briefs. One Friday afternoon, as Ricardo was about to leave for the weekend, Jorge called him into his office. The invitation was unexpected, and Ricardo felt a surge of anxiety as he made his way down the corridor. Jorge's office was a stark contrast to the rest of the firm, warm and inviting, with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books lining the walls. "Ricardo, come in," Jorge said, his tone friendly yet authoritative. He gestured to a chair in front of his massive oak desk. "I've been impressed with your work so far. I think it's time for you to take on a more significant role." Jorge handed him a thick folder. "This case is of utmost importance to the firm. It involves a major client, and I need someone I can trust to handle it discreetly." Ricardo took the folder, feeling the weight of the responsibility. "Thank you, Jorge. I won't let you down," he replied confidently, though inside he felt a flicker of unease. Back in his office, Ricardo opened the folder and began reviewing the documents. The case was a complex corporate merger involving millions of reais. As he read through the details, that sense of unease grew. There were numerous inconsistencies and questionable practices that set off alarm bells in his mind. It quickly became apparent that the firm's client had engaged in activities that were not just unethical, but potentially illegal. Ricardo's mind raced. He knew that pursuing this case could bring significant benefits to his career, but it also meant turning a blind eye to corruption. The more he read, the clearer it became that this was not just a simple legal dispute, it was a web of deceit implicating several powerful individuals, including some within Mendez and Associates. The weekend passed in a blur as Ricardo pored over the documents, trying to make sense of the mess. By Sunday night, he had a plan. He would gather more information and, if necessary, confront Jorge with his findings. He hoped that perhaps there was an explanation, some way to reconcile the firm's actions with his own moral compass. On Monday morning, Ricardo arrived early at the office. He decided to start by examining the firm's internal records, hoping to find more context. As he searched through the digital archives, he stumbled upon a series of emails that confirmed his worst suspicions. The correspondences detailed deliberate efforts to manipulate legal outcomes, bribe officials, and cover up illicit activities. Ricardo felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was bigger than he had anticipated. He knew he had to tread carefully. Any misstep could jeopardize not only his career but also his safety. He printed the most incriminating documents and locked them in his desk drawer, planning his next move. That evening, as he was about to leave, Jorge appeared at his office door. "How's the case coming along?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes probing. Ricardo took a deep breath. "It's complex. There's a lot to unravel," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Jorge nodded, seemingly satisfied. "I have no doubt you'll handle it. Just remember, Ricardo, discretion is key. Our clients trust us with their most sensitive matters." As Jorge left, Ricardo couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He knew he was now playing a dangerous game. The line between right and wrong was blurring, and the stakes were getting higher by the minute. That night, Ricardo shared his concerns with Mariana again. "It's not just a challenging case, Mariana. There's something deeply wrong here. I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice heavy with worry. Mariana took his hand, her gaze steady. "Follow your instincts, Ricardo. Do what you know is right, even if it's difficult." Her words resonated with him. He knew she was right. The next steps would be crucial, and he had to be prepared for whatever came next. The abyss he had discovered was deep and dark, and it threatened to swallow him whole if he wasn't careful. Determined to find a way to handle the situation without compromising his integrity, Ricardo steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The journey was just beginning, and he had to navigate it with both caution and courage. The weeks that followed were a test of Ricardo's resolve. He continued to work diligently on the merger case, all the while discreetly gathering more information about the firm's questionable activities. Each day, the weight of his discoveries grew heavier. He knew he was walking a fine line, and the constant feeling of being watched only added to his stress. One evening, as Ricardo was reviewing documents in his office, he noticed something unsettling. A black car had been parked across the street for several hours, its occupants occasionally glancing up at his window. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the feeling lingered. The next morning, Ricardo was called into Jorge's office. As he entered, he saw a man he didn't recognize sitting next to Jorge. The stranger's presence set Ricardo on edge. "Ricardo, this is Mr. Silva," Jorge said, gesturing to the man. "He's our new head of security." Mr. Silva extended a hand, his grip firm and his smile devoid of warmth. "Pleasure to meet you, Ricardo. I'm here to ensure the safety and confidentiality of our operations." Ricardo nodded, a sense of foreboding settling over him. The message was clear: the firm was tightening its grip, and any misstep could have serious consequences. That evening, Ricardo's anxiety followed him home. Mariana noticed his tense demeanor and pressed him for details. "What's wrong, Ricardo? You've been on edge for weeks." He hesitated, weighing the risks of sharing too much. "I've been working on a high-profile case, and it's complicated. There are things going on at the firm that I can't ignore." Mariana's eyes filled with concern. "What kind of things?" "Corruption, bribery, unethical practices. I'm trying to gather enough evidence to confront Jorge, but I have to be careful." "They're watching me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Mariana took his hand, her grip reassuring. "You need to be careful, Ricardo. But you also need to do what's right. We're with you, no matter what. Her support gave Ricardo the strength he needed. He resolved to continue his investigation, but with even greater caution. He began storing copies of the incriminating documents in a secure location outside the office, ensuring that if something happened to him, the truth would still come to light. As the days passed, Ricardo noticed subtle changes in the office environment. Conversations would abruptly stop when he entered a room, and colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. He knew the walls were closing in, but he remained determined to see his mission through. One afternoon, as he was leaving for a lunch break, he overheard a conversation between two partners in the corridor. "We need to keep an eye on him," one of them said. "He's getting too close." Ricardo's heart raced. He was running out of time. That evening, he met with a trusted friend, Felipe, who worked as an investigative journalist. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Ricardo laid out his findings. "Felipe, I need your help. The firm is involved in serious corruption, and I have the evidence to prove it." "But I can't do this alone," Ricardo said, his voice urgent. Felipe listened intently, his expression grave. "This is huge, Ricardo. If what you're saying is true, this could bring down some very powerful people." "I know. That's why I need to be careful." "They have eyes everywhere," Ricardo replied. Felipe agreed to help, but warned Ricardo to be extremely cautious. "We need to plan this carefully. Any mistake could put you and your family at risk." Returning home that night, Ricardo felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. The truth had to come out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The next day, Ricardo began implementing the plan he had discussed with Felipe. He started planting small pieces of evidence in places where they could be found by the right people, hoping to create a trail that would lead to the exposure of the firm's corrupt activities. But as he continued his covert operations, the feeling of being watched intensified. He noticed new security cameras installed in the hallways and felt the constant presence of Mr. Silva's men. Every step he took was monitored, every conversation overheard. Despite the mounting pressure, Ricardo pressed on. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he was driven by a sense of justice and a desire to protect his family. The noose was tightening, but he refused to be strangled by it. As he left the office one night, he received a message from Felipe: "I have a plan. Meet me tomorrow." The message was both a beacon of hope and a reminder of the peril he faced. Ricardo knew that the next steps would be crucial, and he had to be prepared for whatever came next. The journey was growing darker, and the stakes higher, but Ricardo's resolve was unshaken. The abyss he had discovered was deep and treacherous, but he was determined to navigate it with courage and integrity. The following morning, Ricardo woke up with a sense of foreboding. Felipe's message had been brief but urgent, and Ricardo knew that today could mark a turning point in his struggle against the corruption at Mendez and Associates. He left the house early, kissing Mariana and Lucas goodbye with a forced smile that barely concealed his anxiety. He met Felipe in a small, nondescript cafe far from the prying eyes of the city center. The journalist was already there, sipping coffee and scanning the room cautiously. He waved Ricardo over to a secluded corner table. "Good to see you, Ricardo," Felipe said, his tone serious. "I've been looking into some of the names you gave me. This goes deeper than I thought." Felipe slid a folder across the table. "Inside, you'll find a list of officials and businessmen who are tied to your firm's activities. We've got enough to start making noise, but we need more concrete evidence to ensure it sticks." Ricardo opened the folder and quickly skimmed through the documents. It was a treasure trove of information, linking Mendez and Associates to a network of corruption that spanned multiple industries and government offices. But it was also clear that they were dealing with powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. "We need to be strategic," Felipe continued. "If we go public too soon, they'll bury us. But if we wait too long, they'll find a way to silence us." Ricardo nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll get you more evidence. There's a meeting today where I might be able to gather additional proof." But we need to move quickly. Jorge and his cronies are getting suspicious. As Ricardo left the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He took a longer route back to the office, frequently glancing over his shoulder. The streets of Sao Paulo felt more oppressive than ever, the bustling city now a web of potential threats. Back at the office, Ricardo immersed himself in work, trying to act as naturally as possible. The upcoming meeting was crucial. He needed to stay calm and collected, despite the storm brewing inside him. When the time came, he made his way to the conference room, a large, imposing space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. The meeting was chaired by Jorge, who was flanked by other senior partners. The atmosphere was tense, with the air thick with unspoken suspicions and veiled threats. As the discussion progressed, Ricardo kept his focus on the documents and presentations, looking for any opportunity to gather incriminating evidence. Towards the end of the meeting, Jorge made a cryptic remark that caught Ricardo's attention. "We need to ensure that our clients' interests are protected at all costs. Discretion and loyalty are paramount." Ricardo's heart raced. He knew this was a veiled warning. As the meeting adjourned, Jorge approached him. "Ricardo, a word in private?" They walked to Jorge's office, where Jorge closed the door behind them. "I hope you understand the importance of discretion in our line of work," Jorge said, his tone menacingly calm. "Our clients trust us with their most sensitive matters. Any breach of that trust would have severe consequences." Ricardo met Jorge's gaze, trying to mask his fear with resolve. "I understand, Jorge. I'm fully committed to the firm's success." Jorge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Good. Make sure it stays that way." With that, he dismissed Ricardo, leaving him to grapple with the implied threat. Ricardo returned to his office, his mind racing. He had to act fast. He locked the door and began copying files onto a flash drive, ensuring he had duplicates of the most damning evidence. His hands shook slightly as he worked, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Ricardo noticed the black car again, parked across the street. This time, there was no doubt, it was watching him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and walked out of the building. As he approached his own car, two men stepped out of the black vehicle and intercepted him. "Mr. Ricardo, we'd like to have a word," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. They led him to a nearby alley, away from the main street. "We've noticed you've been taking a lot of interest in things that don't concern you," the man continued. "That's a dangerous habit." Ricardo's heart pounded, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm just doing my job," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled coldly. "Let's hope it stays that way. For your sake, and for your families." The threat was clear. As Ricardo drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about the danger he was in. When he arrived, Mariana immediately sensed something was wrong. "Ricardo, what happened?" He took a deep breath and told her everything. Mariana listened, her face growing pale. "This is serious, Ricardo. You need to be careful." "I know," he replied, his voice heavy with worry. "But I can't turn back now. I have to see this through." Mariana nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We're in this together. Just promise me you'll be careful." Ricardo squeezed her hand, feeling both reassured and terrified. The first blow had been struck, and he knew the stakes were higher than ever. But with Mariana's support, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. He would continue to fight, no matter the cost. The next day, Ricardo arrived at the office with a new sense of purpose. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. The truth had to come out, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The game was on, and he was ready to play. The morning sun cast long shadows as Ricardo made his way to the office, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind. He knew he needed to proceed with extreme caution. The stakes were higher than ever, and any misstep could be catastrophic. He had to gather more evidence and find allies within the firm who shared his values. Ricardo's first task was to identify potential allies. He began by discreetly observing his colleagues, looking for signs of discontent or hints of integrity in their conversations. It was a delicate balance, as he couldn't afford to tip his hand too soon. After a few days, he started to notice patterns. Some colleagues seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the firm's darker dealings, while others were clearly complicit or indifferent. One evening, Ricardo stayed late at the office, waiting for the right moment to approach one of the junior associates, Clara. She had always seemed principled and had subtly expressed discomfort with some of the firm's practices in their previous conversations. "Clara, do you have a minute?" Ricardo asked as she was packing up for the day. She looked up, surprised but curious. "Sure, Ricardo. What's up?" "I need to talk to you about something important." "Can we speak somewhere private?" he asked, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. Clara nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone. They moved to a small, rarely used conference room and closed the door behind them. "Clara, I need to know if I can trust you," Ricardo began, his voice low and urgent. "I've discovered some things about the firm, serious things. Corruption, bribery, unethical practices. I need help to expose it, but I can't do it alone." Clara's eyes widened in shock. "Are you serious?" "This could ruin us, Ricardo." "I know," he replied, "but it could also save us. We can't continue to work in a place like this, knowing what we know. Will you help me?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded resolutely. "Yes, I'll help. But we need to be extremely careful. If they find out what we're doing, it won't just be our jobs on the line." With Clara on board, Ricardo felt a glimmer of hope. They began to meet secretly, sharing information and planning their next steps. Clara's access to different parts of the firm's operations proved invaluable, allowing them to gather more evidence without arousing suspicion. Meanwhile, Ricardo maintained his outward facade of dedication to the firm, continuing to work on his assigned cases with the same intensity as before. He knew that any sign of distraction or deviation from his usual performance could raise red flags. One afternoon, Clara approached Ricardo with urgent news. "Ricardo, I think I found something. It's bigger than we thought." They met in the same conference room, where Clara handed Ricardo a set of documents. "These are financial records that show direct payments to government officials. It's undeniable proof of bribery." Ricardo scanned the documents, feeling a mix of triumph and dread. This was the concrete evidence they needed, but it also meant they were getting closer to the point of no return. "We need to get these to Felipe," Ricardo said. "This is the kind of evidence that will make it impossible for them to deny the corruption." Clara nodded. "But how do we do it without getting caught?" "We'll have to be creative," Ricardo replied. "I'll make a copy of these and deliver them to Felipe myself. We'll need to plan it carefully to avoid any suspicion." That evening, Ricardo made copies of the documents and hid them in a secure location. He then contacted Felipe, arranging a secret meeting to hand over the evidence. They decided to meet in a busy public park, where it would be easier to blend in and avoid detection. The next day, Ricardo left the office at lunchtime, telling his colleagues he had a personal errand to run. He made his way to the park, constantly checking his surroundings for any signs of surveillance. Felipe was waiting at a bench near the fountain, casually reading a newspaper. Ricardo sat next to him, handing over a manila envelope filled with the copied documents. "This is it, Felipe. This is the proof we need." Felipe glanced inside the envelope and nodded. "I'll start working on this immediately. We'll need to verify everything and build a strong case before going public. Be careful, Ricardo. They're not going to take this lying down." Ricardo returned to the office, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. The web of corruption was vast and powerful, but he was more committed than ever to bringing it to light. He and Clara continued their covert operations, gathering more evidence and carefully planning their next moves. As the days passed, Ricardo noticed an increase in the firm's security measures. It was clear that Jorge and the other partners were growing more paranoid, suspecting that something was amiss. New security cameras were installed, and Mr. Silva's men seemed to be everywhere, watching and listening. Despite the heightened tension, Ricardo and Clara pressed on. They knew that the more evidence they could gather, the stronger their case would be. Each piece of information they uncovered brought them closer to exposing the truth, but also closer to the danger that loomed over them. One night, as Ricardo was leaving the office, he received a call from Felipe. "Ricardo, we've got a problem. I think they know we're onto them. My sources are reporting unusual activity, disappearing documents, sudden transfers of funds. We need to move faster." The urgency in Felipe's voice sent a shiver down Ricardo's spine. "Understood. We'll step up our efforts. Be careful, Felipe." The noose was tightening around them, and Ricardo knew they had to act quickly. The firm's corrupt leaders were becoming increasingly desperate, and the risk of exposure made them dangerous. Ricardo and Clara doubled their efforts, working tirelessly to collect the final pieces of evidence needed to bring down the corrupt network. The tension was palpable, but Ricardo's resolve was unwavering. He knew the dangers, but he also knew that the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. With Clara by his side and Felipe working tirelessly to build the case, Ricardo felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight against corruption was far from over, but he was ready to see it through to the end. The days that followed were some of the most intense of Ricardo's life. The atmosphere at Mendez and Associates had grown palpably tense. Ricardo and Clara continued their covert operations, each step fraught with the fear of discovery. They knew that Jorge and the senior partners were growing increasingly paranoid, and their increased security measures were a testament to that. Ricardo met with Felipe more frequently, each meeting filled with the urgency of their situation. Felipe was making progress on building a solid case, but he needed more evidence to ensure it was airtight. The stakes were higher than ever, and the risk of exposure loomed over every move Ricardo made. One evening, as Ricardo was working late in his office, he received a call from Mariana. "Ricardo, there's a black car parked outside our house." "It's been there for hours," she said, her voice trembling with fear. Ricardo felt a surge of panic. "Stay inside, lock all the doors, and keep Lucas with you." "I'll be home as soon as I can," he reassured her, his mind racing. After hanging up, Ricardo quickly packed his belongings and left the office, his heart pounding. He took a circuitous route home, constantly checking his rearview mirror for any signs of being followed. The black car was gone when he arrived, but the sense of unease remained. That night, Ricardo sat with Mariana and Lucas, discussing their safety and the importance of staying vigilant. "We're getting close to something big, Mariana. They're getting desperate, and that makes them dangerous," he explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "We'll be careful, Ricardo," Mariana said, her eyes reflecting her worry. "But you need to be careful too. Promise me you'll watch your back." "I promise," Ricardo replied, feeling the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. The next morning, Ricardo and Clara met in the conference room to discuss their next steps. "We need to find more solid evidence," Clara said, her voice hushed. "Something that directly links the senior partners to the corrupt activities." "I agree," Ricardo replied. "We're running out of time, and we need to make our move soon." They decided to focus their efforts on the firm's financial records, hoping to find irrefutable proof of the illegal transactions. Clara managed to access a series of encrypted files that detailed payments to various officials and shell companies. It was exactly what they needed, but decrypting the files was a complex task. As they worked, Ricardo noticed Mr. Silva watching them from a distance. His presence was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Ricardo and Clara kept their interactions professional and tried to avoid drawing any suspicion. That afternoon, Ricardo received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was one of the firm's older associates, Carlos, who had always been friendly but distant. "Ricardo, can we talk?" Carlos asked, closing the door behind him. "Of course, Carlos. What's on your mind?" Ricardo replied, masking his surprise. Carlos hesitated for a moment before speaking. I've noticed some things, strange things. I think you know what I'm talking about. Ricardo felt a surge of hope. Yes, I do. What have you noticed? Carlos glanced around nervously. I've seen documents disappearing, conversations ending abruptly when certain partners walk in. I think they're hiding something, and it's not just business as usual. Ricardo nodded, deciding to take a risk. Carlos, I'm glad you came to me. I've been investigating this for a while, and I need your help. We're trying to expose the corruption within the firm, but we need more evidence. Carlos looked relieved. I thought I was going crazy. I'll help in any way I can. With Carlos on their side, Ricardo and Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Carlos had access to areas and information they hadn't been able to reach, providing a crucial advantage. The three of them began working together, sharing information and coordinating their efforts to gather the final pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, Felipe continued to build the case, ensuring that each piece of evidence was verified and ready for presentation. They were close to having enough to go public, but the increased security measures at the firm made every step riskier. One evening, as Ricardo was leaving the office, he noticed two men following him. He quickened his pace, trying to lose them in the crowd. He darted into a nearby bookstore, weaving through the aisles until he was sure he had lost his pursuers. His heart pounded as he made his way to a different exit and hurried home, taking extra precautions to ensure he wasn't being followed. At home, Ricardo sat down with Mariana and Lucas, discussing the situation openly. We're in a dangerous position, but we're also close to making a real difference. We need to stay vigilant and support each other, he said, his voice filled with determination. Lucas, usually quiet during these conversations, spoke up. Dad, I'm proud of you. What you're doing is important. Ricardo felt a surge of pride and resolve. Thank you, son. That means a lot. The next day, Ricardo and Clara met with Carlos to review their progress. We have enough, Carlos said, his voice confident. The decrypted files show direct payments and communications between the senior partners and various corrupt officials. Ricardo felt a wave of relief. This is it. We need to get this to Felipe and prepare to go public. They arranged a meeting with Felipe, choosing a secure location far from the prying eyes of the city. As they handed over the final pieces of evidence, Felipe's expression grew serious. This is enough to bring them down, Felipe said. But you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, there will be backlash. They'll come after you, and they won't stop until they're taken down. Ricardo nodded, fully aware of the risks. We're ready, Felipe. Let's do this. With the final pieces in place, Felipe began preparing the story for publication. Ricardo, Clara, and Carlos continued to work at the firm, maintaining their cover while waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension was palpable, but the end was in sight. Ricardo knew that the next steps would be the most dangerous, but he was determined to see it through. The fight against corruption was about to reach its climax, and Ricardo was ready to face whatever came next. The day of the planned reveal arrived with an uneasy calm. Ricardo woke up early, his mind racing with thoughts of the imminent confrontation. He had made sure that Mariana and Lucas were safe, arranging for them to stay with relatives outside the city. The safety of his family was his top priority, and knowing they were out of harm's way gave him the strength to face what was coming. Ricardo arrived at the office, his heart pounding. He felt the weight of the evidence he carried, both physically in the flash drive in his pocket and mentally with the knowledge of what was at stake. Clara and Carlos were already in place, ready to support him and ensure everything went according to plan. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning, a regular strategy session where the senior partners would discuss ongoing cases and future plans. Ricardo knew this was the perfect moment to strike. He had coordinated with Felipe to have the story ready for release, and everything was set to unfold simultaneously. As the partners gathered in the conference room, Ricardo felt a surge of adrenaline. Jorge was there, along with the other key players in the firm's corruption. The room was filled with the usual tension, but today, there was an undercurrent of something more: anticipation. "Let's get started," Jorge said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed himself untouchable. The partners began discussing routine matters, but Ricardo's mind was focused on the flash drive in his pocket and the plan they had meticulously crafted. When it was his turn to present, Ricardo stood up, his heart racing. "I have something important to discuss," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. He walked to the front of the room, connecting his laptop to the projector. As the screen lit up, Ricardo began displaying the documents he and his allies had gathered. "What you're about to see is evidence of corruption, bribery, and illegal activities conducted by this firm and its senior partners," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. The room fell silent, the partners staring at the screen in shock and disbelief. Jorge's expression turned from confusion to anger as he realized the gravity of what was happening. "Ricardo, what is the meaning of this?" Jorge demanded, his voice icy. "This is the truth, Jorge. The truth about what this firm has become and the illegal activities you've been orchestrating," Ricardo replied, meeting Jorge's gaze without flinching. The presentation continued, each slide revealing more incriminating evidence. Ricardo felt a mix of fear and triumph as he exposed the depths of the corruption. He knew that Felipe was simultaneously releasing the story, ensuring that the public would see the same evidence in real time. Jorge stood up, his face red with rage. "This is outrageous. You have no proof." "We have more than enough proof," Ricardo interrupted, his voice firm. "And the public is seeing it right now. There's no hiding from this." At that moment, the conference room door burst open, and several police officers entered, led by an investigator from the anti-corruption unit. "Everyone stay where you are," the lead officer commanded. "We have warrants for the arrest of several individuals here." The room erupted into chaos as the officers began detaining the senior partners. Jorge tried to resist, but the officers quickly subdued him. Ricardo watched as his former mentor was handcuffed and led away, a mix of relief and sadness washing over him. Clara and Carlos joined Ricardo at the front of the room, their faces reflecting the same mixture of emotions. "We did it," Clara said quietly, her voice filled with both relief and disbelief. "Yes, we did," Ricardo replied, feeling the weight of the past months lift off his shoulders. As the officers cleared the room, Ricardo received a call from Felipe. "The story is live, and it's already making waves." "You did it, Ricardo." "Thank you, Felipe." "We couldn't have done it without you," Ricardo replied, gratitude evident in his voice. The aftermath of the reveal was intense. News outlets picked up the story, and the corruption scandal became the top headline across the country. Mendez and Associates was thrust into the spotlight, its reputation in tatters. The arrests continued, with more individuals implicated as the investigation expanded. Ricardo knew that his life would never be the same. The firm was shut down, and he, along with Clara and Carlos, were hailed as whistleblowers who had taken a stand against corruption. They received both praise and threats, but their actions had sparked a movement towards greater transparency and accountability in the legal profession. In the weeks that followed, Ricardo and his family tried to find a new sense of normalcy. Mariana and Lucas returned home, and they began rebuilding their lives. The threat of retaliation remained, but Ricardo felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the abyss and emerged with his integrity intact. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Mariana looked at Ricardo with pride. "You did the right thing, Ricardo. No matter what happens next, remember that." Ricardo smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I will. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." With the support of his family and the knowledge that he had made a difference, Ricardo looked to the future with hope. The fight against corruption was far from over, but he was ready to continue the battle, knowing that integrity and courage could prevail even in the darkest of times. The big reveal had changed everything, but it had also reaffirmed Ricardo's belief in justice and the power of doing what was right. And as he prepared for the challenges ahead, he knew that he was not alone in this fight. Together, they would continue to strive for a better, more honest world. The weeks following the big reveal were a whirlwind of activity. Ricardo found himself at the center of a media storm, with reporters constantly seeking interviews and comments. The scandal at Mendez and Associates had rocked the legal world, and the public was eager for updates on the fallout. Despite the chaos, Ricardo tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for his family. Mariana and Lucas had returned home, and they worked together to establish a new routine. Ricardo knew that their lives would never be the same, but he was determined to protect his family and rebuild their sense of security. One morning, Ricardo received a call from Felipe. "Ricardo, the story is gaining traction. More people are coming forward with information. This is bigger than we thought." Ricardo felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "That's good news, Felipe. But it also means more exposure. We need to be careful." Felipe agreed. "I understand. But we have a strong case, and the authorities are fully involved now. You did the right thing." Ricardo spent his days meeting with investigators, providing testimony, and coordinating with Felipe to ensure that the truth continued to come out. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, and the investigation expanded to uncover more layers of corruption within the firm and its clients. One afternoon, as Ricardo was reviewing documents at home, he received a visit from a high-ranking government official. "Mr. Ricardo, we appreciate your cooperation in this matter. Your actions have been instrumental in exposing this corruption." The official handed Ricardo a letter. "This is a formal commendation for your bravery and integrity. The government recognizes your contribution to justice." Ricardo accepted the letter, feeling a deep sense of validation. "Thank you. It's been a difficult journey, but I'm glad the truth is coming out." As the investigation progressed, more arrests were made. High-profile figures in business and government were implicated, and the scandal continued to dominate the headlines. Mendez and Associates was officially dissolved, and its assets were seized by the authorities. Clara and Carlos faced their own challenges. Clara received threats and had to take extra precautions for her safety. Carlos, who had been a senior associate at the firm, struggled to find new employment due to his involvement in the scandal. Despite these difficulties, they remained committed to the cause, supporting each other and working to rebuild their lives. Ricardo, too, faced professional setbacks. Despite the commendation from the government, he found it difficult to secure new clients or positions in the legal field. The stigma of being a whistleblower made potential employers wary, and Ricardo knew he would have to carve out a new path for himself. One evening, as Ricardo and Mariana discussed their future, Lucas joined the conversation. "Dad, what are you going to do now?" Ricardo smiled at his son. "I'm not sure yet, Lucas. But I know I want to continue fighting for justice. There are other ways to make a difference." Mariana nodded in agreement. "We believe in you, Ricardo. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." Inspired by his family's unwavering support, Ricardo began exploring new opportunities. He reached out to nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups focused on legal reform and anti-corruption efforts. His reputation as a whistleblower and his knowledge of the legal system made him a valuable asset. One day, Ricardo received a call from an old law school friend who had become a prominent lawyer in a human rights organization. "Ricardo, I heard about what happened. We could use someone with your skills and experience. How would you feel about joining our team?" Ricardo felt a surge of hope. "That sounds like exactly what I've been looking for. Tell me more." As Ricardo listened, he realized that this was the opportunity he needed. It was a chance to use his legal expertise for a greater good, to fight against corruption and injustice on a broader scale. In the months that followed, Ricardo joined the Human Rights Organization, working on cases that exposed corruption and defended the rights of the marginalized. The work was challenging and often dangerous, but Ricardo found it deeply fulfilling. He was making a difference, just as he had set out to do. Mariana and Lucas adjusted to their new life, finding comfort in the stability Ricardo's new job provided. They knew the journey had changed them, but it had also brought them closer together. Ricardo's actions had set a powerful example for Lucas, teaching him the importance of integrity and courage. The fallout from the Mendez and Associates scandal continued to ripple through the legal and business communities. Reforms were implemented, and new regulations were put in place to prevent such corruption from occurring again. Ricardo's name became synonymous with bravery and justice, inspiring others to take a stand against wrongdoing. One evening, as Ricardo walked home from work, he received a call from Felipe. "Ricardo, the final report is out. You've done it. You've made a real difference." Ricardo paused, taking in the weight of Felipe's words. "Thank you, Felipe. I couldn't have done it without you and everyone else who believed in the truth." As Ricardo hung up, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. He had faced the abyss and emerged stronger, with his integrity intact. The fight against corruption was far from over, but Ricardo knew he was ready to continue the battle. With his family by his side and a renewed sense of purpose, he looked to the future with hope and determination. The fallout from Mendez and Associates had changed his life forever, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in justice and the power of doing what was right. And as he prepared for the challenges ahead, Ricardo knew that he was not alone in this fight. Together, they would continue to strive for a better, more honest world. Months had passed since the dismantling of Mendez and Associates. The dust had settled, and life began to take on a new rhythm for Ricardo and his family. Though the shadows of the past still loomed, the future seemed brighter and more hopeful. Ricardo's work with the human rights organization had gained momentum. He was deeply involved in several high-profile cases that aimed to expose corruption and fight for justice. The transition from corporate law to human rights had been challenging, but it was also incredibly rewarding. He felt a renewed sense of purpose each day as he fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. One crisp morning, Ricardo received an unexpected visit at his office. A young lawyer, freshly graduated and full of ambition, stood nervously at the door. "Mr. Ricardo, my name is Julia," she began. "I've heard a lot about your work, both at Mendez and Associates and here. I want to learn from you. I want to help make a difference." Ricardo saw a reflection of his younger self in Julia's eyes. He smiled warmly. "Come in, Julia. Let's talk." As they discussed her aspirations and how she could contribute to their cause, Ricardo felt a sense of continuity. The fight against corruption and injustice was not just his battle, it was a collective effort, one that would be carried on by the next generation. Julia quickly became an integral part of the team. Her enthusiasm and fresh perspective invigorated the office, reminding everyone why they were there. Ricardo took her under his wing, mentoring her and sharing the wisdom he had gained through his own turbulent journey. One evening, as Ricardo was preparing to leave the office, his phone rang. It was Mariana. "Ricardo, there's a letter for you. It looks official." Curious, Ricardo hurried home. Mariana handed him the envelope, and he carefully opened it. Inside was an invitation to speak at a major legal conference about the importance of integrity and ethics in law. Ricardo read the letter aloud to Mariana and Lucas, feeling a swell of pride. "They want me to share our story, to inspire others to uphold justice and fight corruption." Mariana beamed. "That's wonderful, Ricardo. Your journey has touched so many lives. This is a chance to reach even more people." Lucas, who had grown more perceptive and mature through their shared experiences, added, "Dad, you've shown me what it means to stand up for what's right. I think you should do it." Encouraged by his family's support, Ricardo accepted the invitation. He spent the following weeks preparing his speech, reflecting on the tumultuous path that had brought him to this point. He wanted to convey not just the facts of his experience, but the lessons he had learned and the importance of integrity in every aspect of life. The day of the conference arrived. The auditorium was filled with lawyers, judges, and students, all eager to hear Ricardo's story. As he took the stage, Ricardo felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He glanced at the front row, where Mariana and Lucas sat, their faces glowing with pride. "Good evening, everyone," Ricardo began. "Today, I want to share a story with you. It's a story about ambition, corruption, and ultimately, justice." He recounted his journey at Mendez and Associates, the discovery of corruption, the risks he and his allies had taken, and the eventual exposure of the truth. He spoke about the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult, and the need for integrity in the legal profession. As he concluded his speech, Ricardo looked out at the audience, seeing the impact of his words reflected in their faces. "Each of us has a choice," he said. "We can turn a blind eye to wrongdoing, or we can confront it head-on, knowing that the path to justice is often fraught with challenges. But it is a path worth taking, for ourselves, for our families, and for the future." The audience erupted in applause, and Ricardo felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had not only survived the storm but had emerged stronger, ready to inspire others to continue the fight for justice. After the conference, many attendees approached Ricardo, thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories of struggles and triumphs. Among them was a young law student who said, "Your story has inspired me to pursue a career in public service. I want to make a difference, just like you." Ricardo felt a profound connection to these individuals, knowing that his journey had sparked a ripple effect of change. He returned home that night with a heart full of hope and a renewed sense of purpose. In the months that followed, Ricardo continued his work with the Human Rights Organization, taking on more challenging cases and mentoring young lawyers like Julia. He and Mariana found joy in the small moments of everyday life, while Lucas excelled in school, inspired by his father's example. One day, as Ricardo sat in his office, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, he received a call from Felipe. "Ricardo, there's an opportunity I think you should consider. The government is forming a new task force to combat corruption, and they need someone with your experience and integrity." Ricardo listened, feeling the weight of the decision. Joining the task force would be another step in his fight against corruption, a chance to make an even greater impact. "I'm honored, Felipe," Ricardo said. "I'll discuss it with Mariana, but I think this might be the next step in our journey." That evening, he shared the news with Mariana and Lucas. They discussed the implications and the potential challenges, but ultimately, they agreed it was the right move. "Go for it, Ricardo," Mariana said, her eyes shining with pride. "You were meant to lead this fight." With his family's support, Ricardo accepted the position. As he prepared for this new chapter, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. The fight against corruption was ongoing, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that he was not alone. Together, they would continue to strive for a better, more just world, one step at a time. The journey was far from over, but with integrity, courage, and the unwavering support of his loved ones, Ricardo knew they would succeed.